Griner for Bout swap, which we knew was underway, that we would not report on the details of it. This was at the request of the White House, which asked us not to make it public because officials expressed grave concern about the fragility of the emerging deal and feared it would impede the safety, perhaps even put those Americans at risk. And so we are bringing this news to you first this morning, Gail, and it is certainly good news for the Griner family.
It is so exciting, and of course we kept our word on that.
Of course.
We've known about it for some time. Just to see it happen and come about, Margaret, I can't tell you how excited everybody is that was pulling for Brittney Griner. This is such great news. Thank you, Margaret.
That's right, Margaret. We'll check back in with you a little bit later. And yes, CBS did hold up our end of the bargain. And speaking of that bargain, we do expect to hear from President Biden real soon. Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes joins us right now. Nancy, good morning. What are we hearing?
Good morning, Nate. We have some new information. We were told by a U.S. official a short time ago that the president this morning spoke by phone with Brittney Griner herself and with her wife, Sherelle. We're told that the vice president was in the room in the Oval Office when that call took place. And you can only imagine what kinds of emotions were expressed on that phone call. We know that President Biden has been monitoring this exchange all morning long here at the White House. And we can also tell you that he personally signed the commutation of Viktor Bout's sentence within the past week, which paved the way for this morning's swap. And now this deal appears to have come together quite quickly within the past 2 weeks, according to our reporting, because as recently as the end of November, the State Department was still blasting the Kremlin for a failure to bargain in good faith. Over the summer, White House officials repeatedly told us that they had made an offer for a prisoner swap, but that they were getting no response. Now, that's not the type of thing that they usually reveal publicly, but in this case, they said they felt they had no choice but to up the public pressure because they were getting radio silence from the Russians. Now, Griner's return for Bout is the Biden administration's second prisoner swap with Russia. Back in April, they swapped Marine veteran Trevor Reed for a Russian who had been convicted of smuggling cocaine. At the time, the U.S. used flight tracking services to make sure that the prisoner exchange was taking place as planned, and that's something they may have used today again during the exchange of Griner, who was coming from Russia, and Bout coming from the United States. Now, we don't know exactly where Griner's plane is going to be headed next, but we do know that the eventual destination, of course, is here in the U.S.
All right, Nancy, thank you so much. You know, we had the interview with Sherelle Griner, who is Brittney's wife, a couple of months ago, and she was saying that she had spoken to her on the phone and she was so worried about her mental health that Brittney Griner was very worried that she might have been forgotten in this country. And certainly that has not been the case. People have been working on it, and I can't only imagine. I reached out to Sherelle last week when we knew that this was happening. Of course, she's not saying anything. Nobody wanted to do anything that would jeopardize this day, and now that it is here.
I remember you sitting down with her and asking you, does she have hope? And you said that's all she can is have hope. But you said there was some despair that she had in her eyes because she just did not know. Now she has the answers that we've all been waiting for, which is Brittney is coming home.
Yeah, we want to see that plane land safely. Also, eager for news on her health. I mean, Brittney was in a penal colony for multiple weeks. The conditions are reputed to be very bad. So we shall see.
The labor, the nutrition, even her mental health.
Yeah, it's been a year, right? Almost.
It's been more, This is, I can barely speak. I'm so excited about this news today. Senior investigative correspondent, that's Catherine Herridge, has covered this story since it began. Catherine, Brittney Griner, as we know, is not going to go home immediately. We know that she has to go to a hospital first. Can you walk us through the process about what will happen to her now? What are the steps?
Well, Gail, good morning. This is really the beginning of a journey for Brittney Griner and her family. And while every case is unique, it comes down to a three-phase process. First, as you and Margaret mentioned, a medical and mental health evaluation. Second, what intelligence officials refer to as a strategic debriefing. This generally involves the intelligence agencies as well as law enforcement to understand every element of Brittney Griner's detention, also the conditions, and more specifically, whether the Russians sought to obtain intelligence or information from her. And finally, reintegration. Many hostages I've spoken to discuss how there can be this sense of sensory overload after their captivity and the challenges of reuniting with their family after an experience where they feel they've become a changed person.
Catherine, you recently spoke to some of the federal agents who were involved in the apprehension of Viktor Bout. These are complicated trade-offs, high diplomatic discussions, but I am curious, what did those agents tell you about this man, Viktor Bout, who is now free and going back to Russia?
Well, former DEA agents that were directly involved in this global manhunt for Viktor Bout told us that they've always seen him as a major threat to U.S. national security because he was an arms dealer with global reach because of his deep Russian connections. He was someone who was willing to sell arms to drug cartels, to designated terrorist groups, and individuals with the intent and the capability of harming U.S. Americans and officials. In addition, what we heard from these former agents is that it was a Herculean effort to capture Bout across 3 continents. In 2008 in Thailand, he was eventually extradited to the United States, where he was convicted of charges including conspiring to kill Americans. And finally, they told us they want to see the families reunited, but they had deep concerns about any potential trade with Viktor Bout because of the message they felt it would send, that it made good business sense to target Americans.
It's understandable. Catherine, thank you very much. Appreciate that. We're going to bring in now CBS News foreign policy and national security contributor H.R. McMaster, a retired Army lieutenant general, and he's also national security advisor under President Trump. General, good morning to you. We just talked a little bit there with Catherine about how complicated these trade-offs are. Huge day, very significant prisoner swap, one of the most significant of the Biden administration, arguably one of the most significant America has undertaken going all the way back to the 1960s. I think we should start just with your reaction to it.
Hey, good morning, Tony. Well, yeah, I share your sentiment and what Gail articulated there about how happy we are that Brittney Griner's back. Of course, what we're dealing with is a criminal state, right? We know that Vladimir Putin not only arbitrarily detains innocent people for political leverage, but he also commits murder of individuals and mass murder. What we're seeing in Ukraine and what we saw in Syria and Chechnya from this criminal state. But I think what's really important to note is that a lot of people have been working on this for a long time, and I think it's important to recognize that the Biden administration prioritized, getting Brittney Griner back. They've also prioritized getting others out, like Trevor Reed. And I think this is an important duty for every administration. I remember when Aya Hijazi was released under the Trump administration, or Chaplain Brunson from Turkey. Now, those were from ostensible, partner states. But it's even tougher, to get people out of Russia. And I'll tell you, Tony, it's also important for us to keep in mind those who are left behind. I'm sure that this is what Brittney Griner will make this point as well. This is Paul Whelan and Mark Fogel, for example, who remain unlawfully detained in Russia.
All right, General.
We're thinking about them also today. As happy as we are for Brittney Griner, no one is forgetting the 2 other Americans who are there.
Absolutely. General McMaster, thank you very much. We appreciate your perspective on all this. But we want to emphasize it is a great day. President Biden expected to speak soon. We will, of course, bring you that live when it happens, if it happens during our show. And our coverage of Brittney Griner's release will continue on CBS News Streaming and also your local news. And, of course, as normal, we have much more news ahead on CBS Mornings. This has been a CBS News special report. I'm Tony DeCoppel with Gail King and Nate Burleson, CBS News, New York.
All right, we're going to continue with our breaking news this morning. The WNBA star Brittney Griner is now free. After almost 10 months in Russian custody, Griner is headed back home after the U.S. negotiated her release in exchange for Russian arms dealer Viktor Bout. Griner was arrested in Moscow in February of this year for possession of cannabis oil and then was later sentenced to 9 years in prison. She was moved to a penal colony nearly a month ago after a Russian court rejected her appeal. So CBS News correspondent Christina Ruffini is standing by in Washington to talk with us a little bit more about how all of this happened. So Christina, this is a prisoner swap, a difficult thing to negotiate. I feel like I read not too long ago that the Russians had said nothing's going to happen before the end of the year. Things did not look like negotiations were going well. How do we know about how this development occurred?
Well, it's still coming out. And obviously what we'd heard from the State Department and from American officials throughout this is they put this offer on the table, and the offer itself was controversial because of the man you just mentioned, because of Viktor Bout. Many people may have seen this movie with Nick Cage from years ago, Lord of War. It was loosely based on his life. As you said earlier, this is an international arms dealer. This is someone who's run guns to conflicts all over the world, who at one point was responsible. What he was charged for in the U.S. was running guns in a scheme to target American agents with AK-47s that he was supplying. This is not a good guy, right? This is the biggest chip that the U.S. held. And for a long time, we were hearing from Justice Department sources, from State Department sources, that it wasn't an option, that he wasn't on the table, and that they weren't going to give him up. Obviously, somewhere along the line, whether due to the conditions that Griner is under, whether due to political pressure, whether due to other factors, that offer was made. And then, as you said, they didn't hear much from the Russians, right? There was a stalling. But this is part of the Russian negotiating tactic. They are very adept at leaning into the bureaucracy, leaning into the red tape, much to the frustration and sometimes infuriation of American diplomats. Even when it came to things like visiting Griner, visiting Whelan, visiting Americans detained in these Russian prisons, it's all about bureaucracy. It's all about fill out this form, and then no, now it has to be this form. So this is the game they play. I've been told by many high-ranking American officials that they are if you're playing chess with bureaucracy, the Russians will always win. So it's unclear why they changed course exactly at this point, but they did. The other thing is, the Russians had said this is a 1-for-1. The U.S. was looking for a 2-for-1. So at the end of the day, it'll be interesting to find out how they made that decision, especially since Paul Whelan has been there for 4 years. Griner has not been there as long. What was that calculation? What went into that decision? And who ultimately made the call? If it's 1-for-1, which one do you choose?
Indeed. I am so happy for Griner and her family, but my heart breaks for the Whelan family. We've spoken to them. They have, for lack of a better phrase, played the game the way you're supposed to. They have remained quiet for a long time. They have remained humble and tried to, gain attention for their loved one. And so it's certainly disappointing, but very good news for Griner. She is not heading directly to the U.S., but hopefully she'll be home for the holidays. But what happens in the meantime?
So when you bring someone out of custody, there's a couple things that have to go on. First of all, Russian prisons are not nice places. So she's probably going to need a health check. She'll get a medical check. That usually happens somewhere not on U.S. soil. They could potentially stop somewhere in Germany. They could potentially stop at another U.S. facility, in the Middle East that's closer. They could bring her back, immediately to the U.S., although that's not usually how it works. They need to do a couple things. They need to make sure she's okay. They need to provide her mental health support because obviously she's been through a lot. You got to think about the fact she's an almost 7-foot-tall Black woman who doesn't speak Russian in a system that is not designed for someone her size. I mean, officials we talked to even said the little things like the car they would transport her to court in was too small for her, right? And traffic in Moscow is horrible. So she'd end up handcuffed and hunched over in this tiny car for hours on end. It's just not a place that is designed to accommodate someone like her, which is one of the reasons, people wanted to get her out of there. So they'll need to address that. They'll need to check her health. They also need to do a bit of a security debrief. What did you learn? What were you asked? Were they trying to get information out of you? Obviously, as far as we know, she doesn't have any real connections to the U.S. government. I can't, I'm just assuming there are no big international secrets that she knows that she could have disclosed, but that doesn't mean she wasn't subjected to harsh questioning. And that doesn't mean she didn't see and learn things on her side as well. So that's something that American officials will want to debrief her. They'll want to talk to her. This process usually lasts a couple days to a week, maybe more. And then she should be able to go home to her family.
Well, sooner better than later. Christina, thank you very much. I want to bring in a CBS News senior White House and political correspondent, Ed O'Keefe. Ed, you're joining us on the phone from Washington as well. We know that we'll be hearing from President Biden maybe in about 10 minutes or so. But if you head to his Twitter page, we're already hearing from the president.
We are. You've seen this image of him in the Oval Office this morning with Brittney Griner's wife, the vice president, and the secretary of state, all there hunched over the phone, speaking briefly with Brittney Griner after the release. The White House has been tracking this quite closely over the last several days in hopes of arranging for this swap that, of course, really has been 10 months in the making, but another really powerful image there for a president who's in the midst of one of his best stretches politically and from a policy perspective, to have this case that has drawn so much more and different attention than the detention of Americans abroad normally does, given that Griner, of course, is a professional athlete and someone who had drawn support and concern from the NBA, the WNBA, the entire professional sports world, and so many other advocates. Her wife, of course, had spoken out quite publicly and critically of the administration over the course of this, speaking most recently with Argyle King about her concerns for her wife's safety. So to now have her released is a significant win and a sign that despite all the troubles between the United States and Russia amid the broader conflict in Ukraine, the channels of communication regarding this kind of work, the release of unlawfully detained Americans and Russia's concern about the detention of certain Russian nationals continues and continues in a productive and peaceful way.
And maybe you can shed some light on some reporting that I've seen about President Biden's involvement. I've read that he personally signed the commuting papers for Viktor Bout, that is the arms dealer who was released in exchange for Brittney Griner. Do you know if that's true, and just how involved the president has been?
Well, Anne-Marie, as we've been preparing for this over the last several days, I've deferred on these kinds of details to our colleagues who cover the Justice Department and other legal issues. And what they told us in these conversations that we had internally is that that's how it works. The president would have to sign off because he's the only person who can pardon or commute sentences. And so he was involved and signed that paperwork to allow for Viktor Bout's release from a federal facility in Illinois and allow the transfer to begin in the last 2 days or so in order to get him over to the United Arab Emirates. So that is standard procedure, and it shows you how sensitive and high profile these have to be in order to allow them to happen, because it requires presidential sign-off and involvement.
And I know sort of initially when there was talk of a possible prisoner swap, and once again, this may not be sort of your particular area because you're at the White House, but you know, initially it was a 2-for-1 swap as a possibility that was floated. Paul Whelan, of the former Marine who's been in prison there for the last 4 years or so, had been floated. Do we know anything about the negotiations, what may happen with him moving forward, and whether or not the White House and the administration is continuing to push for his release?
Well, obviously they are, and they've said that publicly, and we know behind the scenes they continue to work on that. There was a 2-for-1 offer and then discussion of other potential scenarios over the summer through the fall. And over the weekend, you saw Secretary of State Blinken discuss some of these details on Face the Nation. But essentially, it became a 1-for-1 agreement, and we'll learn more about why the administration felt compelled to take this version of the deal. But obviously, if it meant her safe return for such a high-profile detainee and somebody who, as Christina was describing, probably faced even more physical danger and distress than others, then it made sense to obviously take it. But obviously there will be great criticism and concern about the fate of Paul Whelan, why he was not part of this, why the United States didn't push more aggressively to get both of them back, especially by the end of this year. And we'll obviously monitor that throughout the day, and there'll be questions about it. But either way, one more American has been released, a high-profile one, and I think the White House and the State Department ultimately wagered that it made more sense to get one now and keep pushing for Wayland's return.
Yeah, indeed. Ed O'Keefe, thank you so much. So just to let everyone know what's going on, WNBA star Brittney Griner has been released from Russian custody. She was sentenced to 9 years in a Russian penal colony after pleading guilty to bringing in marijuana vape cartridges. It was an exchange with a Viktor Bout, who is a Russian arms dealer serving 25 years here in the U.S. for selling weapons the plan was to use those weapons to kill DEA agents. We are going to continue to cover this story. We are expecting to hear from the president in the next 5 minutes or so. For now, though, we're going to take a bit of a break.
An original CBS Reports documentary.
Yoga and wellness has become a place of anti-science.
Online clickbait.
The algorithms feed you content based upon your own fantasy.
Potentially at my peril.
There's no question about it.
Spreading digital disinformation.
Their entire yoga studio and spiritual community got so embedded in all of the QAnon stuff that it became this sick place.
Why pro-health people are fertile ground for anti-science messages.
We can just go into the whole mask thing. A lot of us just believe that's symbolism for silencing people.
People are locked in this mindset. They've been taught to accept what the medical doctors say.
No longer are you going to be willing to take any medical advice.
It's a big problem that we urgently need to address.
An original CBS Reports documentary streaming now. An original CBS Reports documentary.
We need to put an end to this territorial status.
Will statehood create a better Puerto Rico?
So that we have the same quality of life that you see in the States.
What do you worry about?
Me living here in the future?
They're giving incentives to non-Puerto Ricans to come to Puerto Rico
and extract our natural resources and take over our land.
Vacation in Puerto Rico, and in exchange for that, you don't pay taxes.
Why would I allow somebody who abused me for 123 years to then consume me?
An original CBS Reports documentary streaming now.
When weather turns extreme.
States from the plains to the northeast are bracing for more than 2 feet of heavy snow.
Every second counts.
This is a monster winter storm.
CBS News and the Weather Channel bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
There's a wrinkle in the forecast, the accumulating ice.
Oh! You'll have time to get prepared.
Take precautions before you head out.
Feel the forecast on the CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell.
People from every corner of America facing challenges.
Everyone is just looking for some type of connection.
Just raise your hand and say, hey, I'd like to help.
Coming together to find solutions.
We are going to do something about it.
Their stories are our stories.
Welcome to Eye on America.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
We are so excited, we just can't hide it.
CBS Mornings are, well, everything your morning should be.
Let's do it!
Let's go! CBS Mornings, starting at 7.
Stories that inform, inspire, and brighten your day.
I've been waiting patiently for something like this.
Make every day a little more like Sunday morning.
Here comes the sun.
Stream on the free CBS News app Tuesday mornings.
Well, continuing with our breaking news this morning, WNBA star Brittney Griner has been released from Russian custody. She may, in fact, be home for the holidays with her family. She was released in a prisoner swap for a Russian arms dealer serving 25 years here in the U.S. You're looking at a live picture now of the White House. We are waiting to hear from the president at any moment now. We know that he was gathered with Brittney Griner's wife earlier today, and he actually tweeted out just moments ago that he had spoken to Brittney Griner. In his tweet moments ago, I spoke to Brittney Griner. She is safe. She is on a plane. She is on her way home. Brittney Griner was taken to the United Arab Emirates. Initially, she's going to another country before she heads home to the U.S. I want to bring in Nina Khrushcheva. She's joining us now from Moscow. She is a professor of international affairs at the New School. Nina, thank you so much for joining us to give us a little more perspective. It didn't look like this prisoner swap was going to happen, not soon anyway. Some Russian officials had said they weren't really doing anything before the end of the new year. We heard from U.S. officials saying that they can't seem to get any feedback from Russians about a possible prisoner swap. I want to get your initial reaction to this news.
Well, it was great news, obviously, wonderful. And in fact, even if the Russians were saying that there is not much going on, at the same time, they were saying that something is going on behind the closed doors, and that's how we like it. So the Russians don't like all these public performances about the deals that they're trying to make. And in fact, I was thinking about it 2 days ago, because suddenly 2 days ago, the news story came about all over again about the appeal, about the potential conversations that are happening with the United States. And I was thinking something must be going on. We just don't know exactly. And it also in Russia could mean it can continue on for many years, or it can just be resolved immediately. And that seems to have happened. It was resolved immediately.
We don't see many of these releases, prisoner swaps like this. We did see Trevor Reed, who was very, very sick, alien U.S. Marine who was serving time. He was released in April. Can you talk about sort of the nature of the delicate negotiations that have to happen to see a release of this nature?
Well, I am not a diplomat. I really don't know exactly how it's going on. But what I do know that every time when Americans start talking about it and sort of say, well, the Russians are this and the Russians are that, they immediately stop negotiating. That I know. It has to happen quietly. If you talk to us and don't make public PR declarations about it, we're going to work with you. If you're going to do your democratic things, that you're going to run around and say that Russia is horrible and we are going to stand up to them, nothing is going to happen. And clearly that was done very, very delicately. But also look what Russians have gotten. They got Viktor Bout. Viktor Bout, giant fish, as somebody in your program said, the Lord of War. That is a very important man. So the Russians really felt like they have a hand in this because Brittney Griner is really a small fish comparing to Bout, and she got 9 years only because they needed to make her more important than she really was in terms of what she could bring to the table. So I think the Russians feel very good about that, and hopefully Paul Whelan is going to be next. But what kind of deal that they're going to make and when, that's another question.
Nina, I'm really glad you brought that up because, some people may say Brittney Griner pled guilty to bringing a substance into Russia that is illegal. But I think people need to understand that when it's said that she was a pawn in this, in a way, that yes, she was charged, but she was almost overcharged. She was overcharged. Can you talk a little bit about when you actually heard that she had been arrested and for what? Did you immediately think, she's going to be a pawn in a much bigger game?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. I thought they were making a statement, and it was really quite unfortunate because she was a player. She was an athlete in a Russian sports team. So that I thought was just unfair on all levels. But whatever. We're going to discuss it right now. Yes, it was absolutely they were making a statement, and I think it almost felt. I mean, I'm not saying it with certainty. I don't know. Yeah. But it almost felt like they were grabbing somebody just to make point, because I'm sure if they searched a little more, they would be better people. But I think the point was we can do whatever, and that's what we're doing. When she got 9 years, clearly she got 9 years only to have her as great a leverage, because she really, I mean, she was absolutely overcharged, way overcharged. But now, because the whole point is that we overcharged her, but now we can release her because she is in the Russian mind, I mean, everybody's mind, is probably less guilty and much easier to prove that she's less guilty, because we don't know exactly, nobody knows exactly whether Paul Whelan was a spy, was he not a spy. So she's in some way, she's an easier target to be released.
Right. Yeah, and you talk about Viktor Bout. His nickname was the Merchant of Death, which tells you something. I'm curious. You are in Russia. How is this being covered in Russia? How's it being characterized by the Russian media?
Just came out. It really was. I already knew it because I was asked to come in, and I kind of knew it through my channels, but very little information was available. So it just came out. But I'm sure that the TV programs are going to jump up and down saying, well, we got Viktor Bout, and, that was 25 years, and he's such. And I would not be surprised. I mean, I hope it's not going to happen, but it may. He will be member of the Russian Duma soon because he was such a victim of American injustice. So I'm sure the Russians will see it as a great victory. But nonetheless, it's very important that Brittney Griner is free. That's amazing and remarkable and wonderful that it happened.
Yeah, it's certainly a reason for much celebration. You sort of stunned me there when you said that there's a possibility that Viktor Bout could become part of the government, essentially. Can you talk to me a little bit more about Viktor Bout? We know that he was sort of a notorious arms dealer. Part of the reason he's behind bars in the U.S. has to do with sort of a plan to sell weapons that were ultimately supposed to be used to kill American drug enforcement agents.
Well, I mean, I was sarcastic when I said that, but I'm sure he will be celebrated as somebody who went through all this hardship in the United States and whatnot. But also, I mean, the way Americans always talk about they kill Americans, I mean, of course, Americans are also killing other people. So the Russians, that argument for the Russians means nothing. They would say, well, kill our people all the time. What do you mean? Or you kill Syrian people, or you kill whatever people. I mean, look at Afghanistan. So that's not an argument. So I will not be surprised if he is celebrated as a hero, if he becomes some sort of advisor on war in Ukraine. As I said, I'm not really being serious. I'm being slightly sarcastic. Yeah. But I would imagine that to some degree, somewhere, he will be celebrated through staying in American prison for that long and being extradited to the United States and whatnot. Although originally, as we remember, Viktor Bout was not a hero here. He was not a hero here at all. But now, because he went through this American experience, and now with all the adversarial relationship and animosity, that would be one of those, the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing.
Nina Khrushcheva, thank you so much. Really appreciate you giving us some perspective from Moscow.
Thank you.
We're going to take you now to a CBS News special report. We are expecting to hear from the president at any moment now.
This is a CBS News special report from New York. I'm Gail King with Tony DeCoppola and Nate Burleson. President Biden is about to speak to us after this morning's great news. A prisoner swapped to free basketball star Brittney Griner. The president tweeted this photo just minutes ago. It shows him and Griner's wife, that's Sherelle, speaking to Brittney Griner on the telephone there at the White House. I am so excited and so shaking. We have all been following this story, of course, from the very, very beginning. The president's going to speak to us in just a second, but first we'll go to Face the Nation moderator and chief foreign affairs correspondent. That's Margaret Brennan joins us. Margaret, I know he's going to fill in the details, but can you tell us what you know so far? How did this come about? Well, never mind, Margaret, hold that. President Biden has just walked to the podium.
Well, good morning, folks, and it is a good morning. Moments ago, standing together with her wife, Sherelle, in the Oval Office, I spoke with Brittney Griner. She's safe. She's on a plane. She's on her way home. After months of being unjustly detained in Russia, held under intolerable circumstances, Brittney will soon be back in the arms of her loved ones, and she should have been there all along. This is a day we've worked toward for a long time. We never stopped pushing for her release. It took painstaking and intense negotiations, and I want to thank all the hardworking public servants across my administration who worked tirelessly to secure her release. I also want to thank the UAE for helping us facilitate Brittney's return, because that's where she landed. These past few months have been hell for Brittney and for Charlie. and her entire family and all her teammates back home. People all across the country have learned about Brittney's story, advocated for her release, stood with her throughout this terrible ordeal. And I know that support meant a lot to her family. I'm glad to be able to say that Brittney's in good spirits. She's relieved to finally be heading home. And the fact remains that she's lost months of her life, experienced the needless trauma, and she deserves space, privacy, and time with her loved ones to recover and heal from her time being wrongfully detained. Brittney is an incomparable athlete, a two-time Olympic gold medalist for Team USA. She endured mistreatment and a show trial in Russia with characteristic grit and incredible dignity. She represents the best about America. It is across the board, everything about her. She wrote to me back in July. She didn't ask for special treatment, even though we've been working on a release from the day one. She requested a simple quote, "Please don't forget about me and the other American detainees. Please do all you can to bring us home." We never forgot about Brittney. We've not forgotten about Paul Whelan, who's been unjustly detained in Russia for years. This was not a choice of which American to bring home. We brought home Trevor Reed when we had a chance early this year. Sadly, for totally illegitimate reasons, Russia is treating Paul's case differently than Brittney's. And while we have not yet succeeded in securing Paul's release, we are not giving up. We will never give up. We remain in close touch with Paul's family, the Whelan family, and my thoughts and prayers are with them today. They have to have such mixed emotions today. And we'll keep negotiating in good faith for Paul's release. I guarantee that. I say that to the family. I guarantee you. And I urge Russia to do the same to ensure that Paul's health and humane treatment are maintained until we are able to bring him home. I don't want any American to sit wrongfully detained and one extra day if we can bring that person home. My administration has now brought home dozens of Americans who were wrongfully detained or held hostage abroad, many of whom had been held since before I took office. And today, we also remember the other Americans that are being held hostage and wrongfully detained in Russia or anywhere else in the world. Reuniting these Americans with their loved ones remains a priority for my administration, every person in my administration involved in this. And we're going to continue to work to bring home every American who continues to endure such an injustice. We also want to prevent any more American families from suffering this pain and separation. And I strongly urge all Americans to take precautions, including reviewing the State Department's travel advisories before they travel overseas, which now includes warnings about the risk of being wrongfully detained by a foreign government. Make no mistake about it. This work is not easy. Negotiations are always difficult. There are never any guarantees. But it's my job as President of the United States to make the hard calls and protect American citizens everywhere in the world, anywhere in the world. And I'm proud that today we have made one more family whole again. So welcome home, Brittney. And now I'd like to invite Sherelle to say a few words to you all. Of course, she's not excited at all about this. Sherelle, it's all yours, kiddo. Congratulations again.
Thank you. So over the last 9 months, you all have been so privy to one of the darkest moments of my life. And so today I'm just standing here overwhelmed with emotions, but the most important emotion that I have right now is just sincere gratitude for President Biden and his entire administration. He just mentioned this work is not easy, and it has not been. There's been so many hands involved, and so I'd like to take a moment to just specifically mention a few. Vice President Harris, Secretary Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Josh Geltzer from the National Security Council, Roger Cartson and Fletcher Schoen from the Hostage Envoy's Office. A special thank you to Governor Richardson and Mickey, the Mercury Players, the WNBA, for your advocacy. And also, you guys may not know this, but my family has been tremendously supported by the Wasserman Agency. BG's agent, Lindsay Colas, has just been amazing for me and my family throughout this process. So today my family is whole, but as you all are aware, there's so many other families who are not whole. And so BG's not here to say this, but I will gladly speak on her behalf and say that BG and I will remain committed to the work of getting every American home, including Paul, whose family is in our hearts today. As we celebrate BG being home, we do understand that there are still people out here who are enduring what I endured the last 9 months of missing tremendously their loved ones. So thank you, everybody, for your support. And today is just a happy day for me and my family. So I'm going to smile right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Mr. President, what has Russia gotten in return, Mr. President? What has Russia gotten in return for this prisoner swap?
When will Brittney be back in the U.S.?
What has Russia gotten in return, Mr. President, for this prisoner swap?
Next 24 hours.
What do you say to the
You just heard Cheryl Griner, Brittney Griner's wife, saying that all she can do right now is smile. That
how soon will he be home?
Okay. Brittney Griner's wife, Cheryl Griner, was just speaking to us where she said all she can do is smile. Right now, as you see, she feels a state of gratitude, but she also made a point of talking about the Whelan family, that she knows that this is a very difficult situation for them. President Biden also addressed that and said that Paul Whelan has not been forgotten, that the Russians apparently view the Whelan situation very differently than Brittney Griner's. But right now, what we can do right now is celebrate that Brittney Griner is in safe hands. It's only a matter of hours before she will be reunited with her wife, and we are all excited about that. I've spent some time with Cheryl. I know the toll that it's taken on her, that it's taken on Brittney, and it's just so great to have this news to report to you today. Face the Nation moderator, Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent Margaret Brennan joins us. Margaret?
Well, Gail,
can you weigh in now on what this all means and what you know?
Well, what the president laid out there was just this one-for-one swap. He did not indicate that there's a broader diplomatic opening with Russia. And remember, Brittney Griner's detention coincided with that really major complication of Russia invading Ukraine. And the low-end relations has made these negotiations that much more tangled and difficult to get to this point. And it was just over the past 5 months since that offer was put on the table in July that the U.S. and Russia have gone back and forth. And it was the Kremlin that said in the end, no, we will not release both Americans. We will only release one in exchange for Viktor Bout, this arms dealer who clearly was highly valued by Russia, and they will now have him back in their custody. And we are already seeing statements from the family of Paul Whelan, that 52-year-old Marine veteran whose family is saying they are so glad. They do not begrudge Brittney Griner her freedom, but they are pressing the administration to, of course, continue to try to secure the release of their loved one. They did point out that this time the White House did let them know in advance that this swap was going to happen. They don't know yet if Paul Whelan has any idea.
Yeah,
Gail?
Delicate process of managing expectations. Margaret Brennan, Margaret, thank you very much. Let's go now to Chief White House Correspondent Nancy Cordes. Nancy, we just heard Margaret mention that the Whelan family was issuing a statement. I think you have it in its entirety. What more can you tell us?
Yeah, it's a pretty emotional statement, Tony. The brother of Paul Whelan, David, starts out by saying that they're so glad that Brittney Griner is on the way home, especially in time for the holidays. Very, very gracious, talking about the fact that the Biden administration made this possible for her. But then the statement takes a turn. He says that the U.S. government did this time let his family know in advance that Paul would be left behind, unlike last April, he says, when they left him there. That early warning, David Whelan says, meant that our family has been able to mentally prepare for what is now a public disappointment for us and a catastrophe for Paul. I don't know, he says, if he's aware yet, although he will surely learn from Russian media. And he expresses concern for his brother's mental health when he finds out about this. Paul Whelan, of course, has been held under punishing conditions for much longer than Brittney Griner had been. He is in a prison camp some 3 300 miles from Moscow. His family was incredibly disappointed when Trevor Reed came home back in April, and everyone at the White House was well aware that his family would be crushed again when they found out that this was going to be a 1-for-1 swap, not the 2-for-1 or 2-for-2 swap that the White House had been proposing early on. And now we have very public proof of that disappointment.
Yeah, that's a difficult part of the story for sure, Nancy Cordes. But I want to go back to Cherelle Griner, who thanked several people in the Biden administration. I know this story is still unfolding, but can you tell us anything about the roles that people she named? Bill Richardson, Jake Sullivan, Kamala Harris. Can you tell us anything, Nancy, about what you know about the people involved in this swap today?
Absolutely. So there is a task force at the State Department that has been established for the sole purpose of trying to negotiate exchanges, deals to bring home the more than 60 Americans that the White House says are wrongfully detained around the world. And obviously, Brittney Griner was at the top of the list of importance to the Biden administration, but she's not the only hostage that they've been negotiating for. Just last month, 5 Americans who were part of the original Citgo 6 that were detained in Venezuela some 5 years ago. They were released in a similar type of deal that sent a couple of Venezuelans back to South America. And so this is an ongoing process. And this time around, the White House made it clear over the summer that they were seeking this deal. They said it publicly because they said they weren't getting any response from Russia through the normal channels. Over the past 2 weeks, there was a rapid increase in the pace of those talks, and now Brittney Griner is coming home.
All right, thank you so much. Now we'll head over to senior investigative correspondent Catherine Herridge. She's with us right now. Catherine, what are we learning?
Well, Nate, as all of this has been unfolding, we've been hearing from a number of our contacts, including a former U.S. official who has been familiar with these negotiations. The official told CBS News that the arms dealer Viktor Bout has always been a top priority for the Russian president for 2 reasons. He's an international arms dealer who was willing to arm not only drug cartels, but also designated terrorist groups, and because of his close relationship with the Russian president. This former U.S. official also told CBS News that they believed, based on the intelligence, that Brittney Griner was deliberately targeted when she was taken hostage, that it was not a coincidence when she was leaving Russia. In addition, we've heard from former DEA agents about this swap, Griner for Viktor Bout, and what they have told us is that they want to see these families reunited, but in this case, it undercuts the rule of law, in their opinion, and sends a very dangerous signal in the future.
Yeah. Catherine, thank you very much.
You're
Definitely a day of celebration for the Griner family, but also concerned people will be monitoring what happens to Viktor Bout. You know, Merchant of Death is one nickname, but Sanction Buster is another, and Vladimir Putin certainly has a lot of sanctions he's trying to get around. Our coverage of Brittney Griner's release, that great news today, it's going to continue on CBS News Streaming and your local news, and we will have much more news ahead here on CBS Mornings. This has been a CBS News special report. I'm Tony DeCopel, Gail King, Nate Burleson, all of us here in New York. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.
All right, we are continuing our coverage of this breaking news that WNBA star Brittney Griner has been released from Russian custody. She was sentenced to 9 years in a penal colony, accused of bringing marijuana vaping cartridges into the country. There have been ongoing negotiations for several months now, and we know that she has been released in exchange for a Russian arms dealer, Viktor Bout, who'd been serving 25 years here in the U.S. She was taken to the United Arab Emirates, and at some point she will be on her way home. They have to check to make sure she's okay, that she's healthy. Penal colonies are terrible places to be, and so there'll be an assessment before she returns here to the U.S. in time for the holidays. But we did see a picture a little earlier today, the president tweeting out a picture of himself and the vice president, as well as Brittney Griner's fiancé, speaking to her on the phone, tweeting out that she is now safe. We want to bring in CBS News correspondent Christina Ruffini, standing by to talk a little bit more about this really surprising news. Listen, Christina, we knew that there were negotiations going on, and for a while there was perhaps there was talk of a 2-for-1 prisoner swap. But then it seemed like in the past few weeks or so, Russian officials said nothing would happen before the end of the year. U.S. officials said that they were trying to talk to Russia, but they weren't getting any feedback. Do we know how things unfolded?
I mean, that's still coming out. But one of the things we've seen in previous hostage negotiations like this is it always gets really quiet right before it happens. And that's because so many things can potentially go wrong. This is not like they do a handshake agreement, they shove them across a bridge, Cold War style, and that's the end of it. This is a very complicated, multifaceted process, and a lot of people have to sign off for it. Even on the U.S. end, you can't just open the door and let Viktor Bout out of prison, right? DOJ has to sign off. In the case of Trevor Reed, the Russian they released in exchange for him, the judge from his case, the presiding judge, had to be informed. There's a whole bureaucratic process that has to start. That takes about 7 to 10 days from the moment the Russians and the U.S. agree, okay, we're going to do this. So it's not an immediate process. And during that 10 days, officials get extremely nervous that something could happen, that it could leak, and that it could get scuttled, because these negotiations are really tenuous. They're really tight, and there are people's lives at play here. Nobody wants to be responsible for Brittney Griner or Paul Whelan or Trevor Reed spending one more day in prison than is absolutely necessary. So everybody gets really tense, it gets really quiet, and then we hear breakthroughs like this. But the issue with these negotiations is also there's always a bit of a give and take between the families who want to put pressure on the administration and want it to be in the spotlight because they feel like that's the best way to get their loved one home, and officials who are often negotiating furiously behind the scenes. But sometimes a spotlight doesn't help, right? Sometimes a spotlight makes Russia or Venezuela or Iran realize the person they have is more important and makes them want to get more out of it. So again, it's a complicated dance. They've been working on it. It's taken a really long time, but she is on a plane and headed out.
All right, Christina Ruffini for us. Thank you, Christina. We appreciate it. Let's bring in CBS News senior White House correspondent and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe. He's joining us on the telephone to talk more about this. Ed, the president there appearing with Brittney Griner's wife, but also we have the statement from David Whelan, who's Paul Whelan's brother. Clearly, they are happy that Brittney Griner is going home, but of course, now the spotlight is once again on Paul. And they don't know if he knows that Brittney Griner is going home, but that's certainly something that they were hoping was going to be a part of this exchange, and now, sadly, it's not. What more can you tell us from the White House?
Well, we know that they've been working furiously to get both of these Americans out of Russia since the start of in Whelan's case, since the start of the Biden administration. Remember when President Biden and President Putin met in Geneva, for example, last year? This was something that was raised with the Russian leader face-to-face, and it was a signal that the two countries could at least keep talking about making some kind of an arrangement. And over the summer, there were reports that the U.S. had essentially offered a 2-for-1 swap, and that was rejected by Russian authorities as well. So, we're likely to learn more throughout today from U.S. officials, whether they say privately or in more background situations, about the ongoing plans to get Whelan home. I was struck that the statement from Whelan's brother points out that it was a late December capture, and so they're coming up on yet another anniversary of his detention, and that obviously will sit poorly with his family and friends who've been pushing for his release. But I think it's notable and incredibly gracious of the Whelan family to acknowledge that any freed American in this situation is a good situation. And that statement also makes clear that these two cases were never tied to each other, never associated. These were isolated incidents, and so there was no need to suggest that both of them had to come out at the same time. But it'll be part of a big push by the State Department to try to get him home.
All right, Ed, thank you very much. And of course, we're going to continue our coverage of the release of WNBA star Brittney Griner from Russian custody. First, we're going to take a bit of a break, though.
Everybody wakes up in the morning and they are pelted with alerts that frighten them, news that agitates them. With this show, we have the time to explain what's going on. These migrants, they've been released. Explain the status that allows them to be released, to slow things down a little bit. What are the big sets of questions for China and its ambitions? Hackers are stepping up their attacks to extort victims. Let's start with easy. Who's attacking? Here's a deeper understanding of what's happening.
Prime Time with John Dickerson. Stream on the free CBS News app. An original documentary from CBS reports tensions rising between a powerful country and a vital island.
The supply of this technology came grinding to a halt. The world would grind to a halt.
Absolutely. As Taiwan faces threats and aggression,
Taiwan is on the front line, and we understand our responsibility as a democracy. We cannot fall.
CBS News examines whether they can defend themselves.
Putin, Ukraine, China, Taiwan, there are manifestations of the battle between autocracy and democracy. And that is a fight that we're all engaged in.
Defending Taiwan, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
When weather turns extreme,
states from the plains to the northeast are bracing for more than 2 feet of heavy snow.
Every second counts.
This is a monster winter storm.
CBS News and the Weather Channel bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
There's a wrinkle in the forecast, the accumulating ice.
You'll have time to get prepared.
Take precautions before you head out.
Feel the forecast on the CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell.
People from every corner of America facing challenges.
Everyone is just looking for some type of connection.
Just raise your hand and say, hey, I'd like to help.
Coming together to find solutions.
We are going to do something about it.
Their stories are our stories.
Welcome to Eye on America.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
When it comes to the money you spend every day, we have you covered every morning. Making money makes sense. Weekdays on CBS Mornings.
After decades in the public eye and public service, this mother-daughter duo is now talking about gutsy women.
What's the gutsiest thing you've ever done?
We go person to person with Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton and Chelsea Clinton.
Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Stories that inform, inspire, and brighten your day.
I've been waiting patiently for something like this.
Make every day a little more like Sunday morning.
Here comes the sun.
Stream on the free CBS News app Tuesday mornings.
Right now, WNBA star Brittney Griner is on a plane heading back to the U.S. after a prisoner swap between the U.S. and Russia. Griner has spent almost 10 months in Russian custody. In exchange for her release, the U.S. swapped convicted arms dealer Viktor Bout. Now, Griner was arrested in Moscow in February of this year for the possession of less than 1 gram of cannabis oil. She was later sentenced to 9 years in prison. She was moved to a penal colony about a month ago after a Russian court denied her appeal. President Biden spoke a short time ago about Griner's release, and here's what he had to say.
Moments ago, standing together with her wife Sherelle in the Oval Office, I spoke with Brittney Griner. She's safe. She's on a plane. She's on her way home. After months of being unjustly detained in Russia, held under intolerable circumstances, Brittney will soon be back in the arms of her loved ones, and she should have been there all along. This is a day we've worked toward for a long time. We never stopped pushing for her release. It took painstaking and intense negotiations, and I want to thank all the hardworking public servants across my administration who worked tirelessly to secure her release.
Joining us now is John Bolton. He was former President Trump's national security advisor from 2018 to 2019, and he joins us on the phone now. Mr. Ambassador, let me just first get your reaction to the news, and if you could also perhaps break down for our viewers the types of negotiations that happen in situations like this.
Well, obviously, there's a lot of very understandable human emotion here in getting Griner released, but this is a very bad mistake by the Biden administration. This is not a deal. This is not a swap. This is a surrender. And terrorists and rogue states all around the world will take note of this, and it endangers other Americans in the future who can be grabbed and used as bargaining chips by people who don't have the same morals and scruples that we do. There are occasions when you swap spies. Obviously, there are legitimate exchanges of prisoners of war. But this doesn't even approximate that. The idea that somehow what Brittney Griner did, very foolishly in my estimate, but that whatever she did compares to Viktor Bout is something that shows just how desperate the administration was to make this deal. And I'm just very worried about the effect it has and the danger that it can put many other Americans in all around the world.
Of course, you know, the reporting is, and I think it's pretty obvious, I don't think I have to say the reporting is, that Brittney Griner was overcharged, that she was charged sort of akin to a drug trafficker, to at least make it seem on paper like these two prisoners were equal. Can you tell me what you know about Viktor Bout and why the Russians would want him back so badly?
Well, I really can't get into specifics, but I'll just note that Paul Whelan, who was likewise set up by the Russians back in late 2018, so when I was at the White House, is still in custody. And I'll just note the historical fact that the possibility of a Bout for Whelan trade existed back then, and it wasn't made for very good reasons having to deal with Viktor Bout. This is a huge victory for Moscow over Washington, and it's the kind of thing that says to terrorists and rogue states and other malign actors who would consider kidnapping or seizing Americans that we're willing to trade almost anything to get Americans back. There are other ways to deal with hostage takers through sanctions and other things, not swaps like this one.
But let me ask you a question. You know, right now, Russia is in the midst of this war with Ukraine. When you talk about sanctions, there are tremendous sanctions against Russia. It certainly hasn't stopped Vladimir Putin from moving forward when it comes to the war in Ukraine. Do you think sanctions would have worked at all at this point, at this stage, this time?
Well, it depends on what you're prepared to do. But I think if you ever go overseas, you should be concerned now that you are a potential target of being seized, not for any reason, but because you're an American. That's what this kind of exchange does. And again, I understand the human emotion at play here, but there are 330 million Americans, and placing any of them in further danger in the future, I think, is a mistake.
So you don't agree with any sort of prisoner swap? Would this have been worth it if Paul Whelan perhaps was included?
Well, I can't speak about the specifics regarding Viktor Bout. There are procedures among civilized nations when a citizen of one commits a crime in another, for extradition, for even after conviction in another judicial system, that the person is sent back to serve their term in a prison of their country of origin. The Russians don't play by those rules, and this is an example of how their system doesn't equal ours, and they get away with it here. They get away with getting back somebody they value extremely highly, and it says to them, boy, this worked out well. We're going to do this again in the future.
Mr. Ambassador, let me just ask you on a practical level, though. I mean, as you are well aware, there are a number of Americans that are being held in foreign prisons all around the world, in Iran, in Venezuela, even in Rwanda. They're not all being given the same consideration that Brittney Griner is being given here, or Paul Whelan. But I wonder, you pointed out that Americans will now be in danger of being grabbed and used as bargaining chips. But realistically, is that what could happen? I mean, Brittney Griner, not all cases are equal. She was very high profile. A lot of people had advocated on her behalf. I don't think that the situation would be the same, sadly, tragically, if it's somebody who doesn't have the same profile as a Brittney Griner or Paul Whelan. And I mentioned those Americans who are being held in those other countries that have not, we've barely, I would venture a guess that most Americans don't even know the names of those individuals that are being held in those foreign prisons. So how realistic is it, your scenario, that now all Americans who travel abroad in countries like Russia or Iran are in danger?
Well, because it depends on the circumstances, that's for sure. But if anything, This says to Hezbollah, Hamas, terrorists in Afghanistan, rogue states like Iran or North Korea, go ahead and take somebody who's high profile, because the politics in America will push a weak administration, which is what we have now, to make a swap. So if anything, the scenario here makes it more likely that high-profile people who travel abroad will be captured. That doesn't make it any better or any worse. All Americans are equal, in my view. I'm sure they are in yours too, whether they're well known or not. Here's somebody very well known was exchanged for a criminal whose offenses you can barely describe, and about whom, as I say, I can't say enough. This is something that in Moscow, in Beijing, in Tehran, in Pyongyang, in the hills and mountains where the terrorists are camped in Afghanistan, this is the best news they've had in a long time.
But again, sir, just break down for us the realpolitik here. I mean, you say the Biden administration is weak, and that's why they negotiated from a position of weakness. But again, I recall back a few years ago, those journalists who were captured in North Korea, they had strayed across the border, and there was a lot of high-level negotiations. I believe I want to say that President Clinton himself, he was no longer in office, but may have had a role in bringing them home. As well as Secretary of State John Kerry or Bill Richardson. The details are foggy to me, but I wonder, when you say that the Biden administration is operating from a position of weakness, I don't understand the basis for that, because what is the upside other than bringing Brittney Griner home for the Biden administration? We understand the upside for Vladimir Putin, but help break down for us what you mean by negotiating from a position of weakness.
Well, if you can get a hostage out without giving a quid pro quo, that's great, because that means the other side has recognized that their position is doing them more harm than not. What this gets for Vladimir Putin is getting a Russian back of incredible value to them, and of a military and other nature, and to send that person back into Russian custody for almost anything is inconceivable to me.
So, Mr. Ambassador, just a finer point on that, and I know you can't speak specifically to Viktor Bout, but then I guess my speculation is that the same discussions that you had in the White House, in the Oval Office with former President Trump and other members of our intelligence community would be similar to the discussions that were had in this administration. And I guess what can we draw from the conclusions that they made that the former President Trump's administration did not make? In other words, to bring these hostages home in exchange for Viktor Bout.
I think the appeasers won in this administration. I think it's very clear.
What is your prediction then now for Paul Whelan? You know, even though these are terrible circumstances, but one thing that the detention, the arrest of Brittney Griner did is actually shed a spotlight on some of the other Americans being detained. Trevor Reed.
We should just point out that David Whelan's statement says that the decision by the Biden administration to bring Brittney Griner home, he welcomes it. He says it is the right. He says it is the right decision.
Both families have been very gracious, sort of between each other. But I wonder now, Viktor Bout is no longer here. What do you think will happen with Paul Whelan?
Well, I don't know what other conversations the administration may have had, but I would say that if the Russians could get Viktor Bout back for Brittney Griner, they're going to say, let's see what a higher price is to release Paul Whelan. That's the danger of negotiation like this.
All right. Ambassador John Bolton, always great to talk to you about situations like this, because we know you're an experienced intelligence official with deep background in situations like this. So we really appreciate your analysis. Thank you very much, sir.
Well, thanks for having me.
All right, let's bring in CBS News correspondent Christina Ruffini, who's standing by in Washington. Christina, you were presumably listening to that conversation that Anne-Marie and I had with Ambassador John Bolton. What do you make of it?
I was. I think there's a couple ways to look at this. You know, the assertion that the administration is negotiating from a point of weakness, I think that's up for debate among what your priorities are, right? If it's your loved one overseas and you know, shipping this arms dealer back to Russia will get them out, then that seems like the correct priority. If you're looking at, bigger strategic geopolitical issues, then it can be debated. But look, Americans are always a target when we're overseas. I mean, Vlad, you and I have traveled to dangerous places together. It's something that's always on your mind. Mm-hmm. That blue passport makes you a target for this very reason. So this is successive administrations have struggled with this. We don't negotiate with terrorists until we do, until someone's loved one, until their lives are at risk, until it's an American that we need back. The Obama administration made a very controversial prisoner swap for Bo Bergdahl. If you remember, they swapped those Taliban leaders. I think it was 5, less than a half dozen, for somebody who had essentially walked off his post. That was very controversial as well. But, the argument from the administration at the time was, this is an American service member. We'll deal with what he did when he gets home. But until then, we're going to do whatever we can. Now, I do know during the Trump administration, he was right in saying they were trying different ways, especially economic ways, to negotiate with the Russians to get, at the time, Trevor Reed, who's now back, and Paul Whelan exchanged. During the Obama administration, they seized a bunch of Russian assets. There are properties around D.C., dachas, consuls across the U.S. that had been seized by the U.S. government. Those were things that were in play at one point too. They were trying to make an argument, okay, give us your guys back and we'll give you back your house on the water in Southern Maryland. That for a long time was the tactic that the last administration and at the first part of this administration they were taking. And somewhere along the line, that calculation switched. Now, you got to ask, of course, the ugly political question. Is it because she's famous? Is it because there's so much pressure from so many different sectors on the administration to get her out? Would they have made this same deal for Paul Whelan? Would the Russians have allowed them to make this deal for Paul Whelan? There's a big difference from the optics from the Russian side. I mean, all politics is local, and that's true even in Moscow, of releasing someone on drug charges and releasing someone on espionage charges, right? Paul Whelan is there on espionage charges, and the Kremlin has made a big deal of saying, the U.S. says it's not true, but of saying we've got this American spy, right? So they are less inclined to give that up because that then weakens their position. Whereas if they can use Griner and say, well, they weren't really getting a lot of political capital out of her, other than the fact that it was bad for the Biden administration. So, I mean, sources I've talked to, the Russians are very good at this game. They've always been very good at this game. You also have to remember that the U.S. officials negotiating this genuinely care about these Americans. They care about Whelan. They care about Griner. That's a different approach than the Russians take, right? They are viewing these prisoners as an asset, as a chip to be played, not necessarily because of their humanity and because they really want them to be safe back home. So it's a good thing that the U.S. approaches this from a more humanitarian approach, but it also can be a weakness, and the Russians know that, and they exploit that. They know if they put terrible conditions on these people, the U.S. is going to do more. The impetus is going to be bigger to get them home sooner because we want them to be okay, right? These are our citizens, and we want them home.
Christina, throughout this whole thing, we've talked a bit about how, at times, inauthentic the Russians can be when it comes to this sort of thing. And it almost felt like there was an element of theater before any proper negotiations could happen. She had to go through, the court system. She had to plead guilty. She had to exhaust her appeals. And we said, before we could even have a real conversation.
Penal colony.
Yes, exactly. Right. Can we, the difficulty of having access to her, telling her wife at this time, your Brittney Griner is going to call you, wait by the phone, and nothing happens. Can you talk a little bit more about that, the process, and how arduous it is?
Yeah, so the Russians wield bureaucratic red tape possibly better than actual conventional weapons. They are masters of this. I've talked to officials, both this administration, the past administration, in the embassy in Moscow. The process of being able to even visit an American that's been detained by the Russians is beyond arduous. And they play these games where it's like, one official described it to me as like, okay, these are the forms, these are the 75 forms you need to fill out to be able to visit your citizen in prison. So they fill them all out, they deliver them, and then they're told 24 hours later, oh, but you didn't use the black ink, you used the blue ink, you're gonna have to do it again. It's these kinds of bureaucratic games that really put the Americans on the back foot, not to mention just visiting, the place where Paul Whelan is and where Trevor Reed was, it's not an easy drive from Moscow. You got to get in a car. It's been described as almost a full day's drive to basically the Russian countryside, staying in random, hunting lodges, hostels, hotels, whatever you can find. You got to get access to these prisons. You got to get in there. It's all of the above. The Russians know what they're doing, and they do it very well. And it goes back to the fact that they know that the harder they make the process, the more it infuriates the Americans, the more they think they have the upper hand in the eventual negotiations when they want something. Also, they're no longer the Soviet Union, but a lot of these officials, including Putin, who's a former FSB agent, are from the Soviet system. They love bureaucracy. They love their paperwork. They love forms in triplicate. And like I said, it's used as an effective weapon, especially when American diplomats are trying to get access to their people being held in Russian facilities.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day right now, it is working out. Brittney Griner will be home with her family, and we are going to continue our coverage of this breaking news, a prisoner swap occurring. After the break, we're going to talk to Nancy Cordes. She's at the White House.
Yeah, one thing I will say, Anne-Marie, too, as we wait to talk to Nancy, is that we've been having some really serious discussions with our correspondents and with Ambassador Bolton about the ramifications of this exchange.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, there is an American citizen who is coming home for the holidays, will be in the loving embrace of her family. And I don't think we should, as we talk about the politics, the bureaucracy, we shouldn't lose sight of that.
This is good news.
Good news
I wish it was good news for all the families who are dealing with this.
As
but,
do I, yeah.
We should celebrate this.
That's right. That's right. So let's take a quick break. We'll be back on the other side. We're going to keep talking about Brittney Griner, Paul Whelan, of course. We're going to talk to Nancy Cordes and our other correspondents. Stay with us.
An original CBS Reports documentary.
Yoga and wellness has become a place of anti-science.
Online clickbait.
The algorithms feed you content based upon your own fantasy.
Potentially at my peril.
There's no question about it.
Spreading digital disinformation.
Their entire yoga studio and spiritual community got so embedded in all of the QAnon stuff that it became this sick place.
Why pro-health people are fertile ground for anti-science messages.
We can just go into the whole mask thing. A lot of us just believe that's symbolism for silencing people.
People are locked in this mindset. They've been taught to accept what the medical doctors say.
No longer are you going to be willing to take any medical advice.
It's a big problem that we urgently need to address.
An original CBS Reports documentary streaming now. An original CBS Reports documentary.
We need to put an end to this territorial status.
Will statehood create a better Puerto Rico?
So that we have the same quality of life that you see in the States.
What do you worry about?
Me living here in the future.
They're giving incentives to non-Puerto Ricans to come to Puerto Rico
and extract our natural resources and take over our land.
Vacation in Puerto Rico, and in exchange for that, you don't pay taxes.
Why would I allow somebody who abused me for 123 years to then consume me?
An original CBS Reports documentary streaming now.
When weather turns extreme.
States from the plains to the northeast are bracing for more than 2 feet of heavy snow.
Every second counts.
This is a monster winter storm.
CBS News and the Weather Channel bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
There's a wrinkle in the forecast, the accumulating ice.
You'll have time to get prepared.
Take precautions before you head out.
Feel the forecast on the CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell.
People from every corner of America facing challenges.
Everyone is just looking for some type of connection.
Just raise your hand and say, hey, I'd like to help.
Coming together to find solutions.
We are going to do something about it.
Their stories are our stories.
Welcome to Eye on America.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
We are so excited, we just can't hide it.
CBS Mornings are, well, everything your morning should be.
Let's do it!
Let's go!
CBS Mornings, starting at 7. Stories that inform, inspire, and brighten your day.
The best part of fame is making people feel good.
Make every day a little more like Sunday morning.
Here comes the sun.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
All right, we're following the breaking news. If you're just joining us here at CBS News, that Brittney Griner, the WNBA star who's been held in a Russian prison for close to 10 months, is now safe, has been freed from Russia in exchange for a convicted arms dealer, Viktor Bout, who is now on his way back to Russia. We're going to break down all that is happening here. Let's get straight to CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes, who's joining us from Washington. So, Nancy, you've heard us talking to our other correspondents, but specifically, I don't know if you caught the conversation that Anne-Marie and I had with former Ambassador John Bolton about why he believes that the Biden administration made a mistake here, that he believes, I think he called it, Anne-Marie, he said that the appeasers have won in this situation. He believes that more Americans will be in danger of being grabbed and abducted by nefarious forces in countries where we don't have good relationships. He says that this puts all Americans at risk. Meanwhile, the statement that we received, and I know you spoke about this, from David Whelan and the family of Paul Whelan, who's still being held in that Russian prisoner, still being held as a prisoner. The family of Paul Whelan says they believe that this decision by the Biden administration to bring Brittney Griner home is the right one.
Right. I mean, this is the classic dilemma that every administration faces, including the administration that Bolton served in, the most recent one, the Trump administration. President Trump also oversaw prisoner exchanges. So did former President George W. Bush. This is, a challenge for time immemorial. Do you agree to a prisoner swap when you believe that the American who is being held is being wrongfully detained as leverage so that the other party can bring home someone who they want to see or extract some other kind of concession? There's no question that there are other countries and bad actors out there who will see this and say, well, wow, if we can nab an American on bogus charges and hold them, maybe we can extract something from the U.S. The U.S. Officials I've spoken to say that they try to dissuade that kind of thing from imposing other penalties when countries do this. So there might be sanctions that go along with it. There might be trade deals that get cut off for a period of time. Certainly, Venezuela has experienced really significant sanctions by the U.S. and other countries, not only because they took Americans hostage several years ago, and there was a swap just last month to bring some of those Americans home, but because of the authoritarian direction that Nicolas Maduro was heading in. So, Bolton is right to say that it is possible in the future that other countries, other bad actors will take this approach. But what Biden officials would argue is that, they still come down at the end of the day on trying to bring innocent Americans home, and that is a choice that many other presidents have made as well.
So we heard from the president not too long ago, maybe about an hour ago. He was in the White House with Brittney Griner's wife at the time that this news dropped, and he tweeted out a picture of all of them talking on the phone with Brittney Griner. What stood out to you about the statement he released?
What was so interesting to me was how carefully orchestrated this all had to have been. Typically, the White House tries to shroud all of this in secrecy until the very last minute because they're so afraid that news might leak out and that something might happen to scuttle the deal. In this case, clearly they brought Cherelle Griner to Washington at least a day in advance. We still don't know whether they told her officially that her wife was going to be freed or brought her here with the promise of meetings with administration officials. So those are the kinds of details that we'll be trying to get today. But she was there in the Oval Office when President Biden spoke to her wife, Brittney Griner, just moments after she was freed. So that is a very emotional picture, but a highly orchestrated event to make sure that she is here in Washington and that yet news of this impending deal didn't leak out.
And so, Nancy, what can you tell us about the negotiations, such as they exist, for Paul Whelan? You shared earlier during the breaking news the statement from David Whelan, where he says, and I'm quoting here, "I'm so glad that Brittney Griner is on her way home." He worries, as does the rest of the Whelan family, that when Paul learns of this, he can't imagine the devastation and the pain that he will feel, having been in captivity for now close to 4 years.
And particularly after the release of Trevor Reed in April. And, Nancy can talk a little bit more about that. In that message from his brother, they talk about how shocked they were that Trevor Reed had been released and they didn't know anything about it.
Right. So I wonder what other bargaining chips, if that's the word to use, and I know it's sort of callous, but, what other opportunities the Biden administration will have. What does Vladimir Putin potentially want to get Paul Whelan home to his family?
Right. I mean, you can imagine an enormous menu of things that Vladimir Putin might want in exchange for releasing Paul Whelan. And it might not just be confined to people who are imprisoned here in the U.S. or elsewhere in the world. I mean, we have slapped enormously painful sanctions on Russia as a result of the invasion of Ukraine. We've worked in concert with our allies. We have slapped a price cap on Russian oil. That's also debilitating. Europeans have worked as hard as they can to import oil and natural gas from other countries. And so Russia is suffering in a variety of ways. And certainly that suffering is of its own making after it invaded Ukraine. But nevertheless, there could be concessions that Russia might try to extract that don't have anything to do with a convicted felon like Viktor Bout. I should point out that those are the kinds of concessions that we tend not to learn about. We don't know if the U.S. agreed to anything other than setting Viktor Bout free after he'd served about half of his 25-year sentence. It's possible that they made some kind of concession that we simply don't know about, we'll never know about. It's possible they made other concessions when they traded Trevor Reed for a convicted drug smuggler back in April. And so the question becomes, what publicly could the U.S. agree to that would make Russia willing to release Paul Whelan? We know over the summer that Russia was interested in perhaps bringing home a convict in Germany who had been charged with murder, basically a state-sanctioned murder by sanctioned by the Russians, and he's in prison in Germany. But that part of the deal kind of fell away. So is that something that Russia might try to resurrect? It doesn't appear that there are any Russian prisoners in the U.S. at this moment who are as notorious and well known as Viktor Bout is. I mean, after all, there was an American movie made about him in which he was portrayed by Nicolas Cage. So who else kind of merits that kind of attention that Russia would be seeking to bring home? That's an open question. And so while you have the president, while you have the Secretary of State being very careful to say they're working on this very hard, working to bring Paul Whelan home, there is absolutely no timeline here. We don't know how long it will take to have him freed.
All right, Nancy, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
We want to bring in CBS News reporter Mary Alushina. She's in Riga, Latvia. Mary, thanks for joining us. So, this news broke maybe about an hour ago or so, maybe a little bit more than that. I know how we're talking about it here in the U.S. I'm wondering if you can give us any insight into how this prisoner swap is being characterized in Russia.
Well, there's quite a lot of jubilation about this. If you remember, Maria Butina, who was also held in U.S. custody, she welcomed this decision. She, described it essentially as a win for Russia. And I think that will be a general perception on Russian state media and from Russian officials that this is the result of this long negotiation process. The Russian foreign ministry said Washington was refusing to give up Bout for a very, very long time, but now they've got him. So I think that is definitely going to be the point of all of the reaction from the Russian side that we are hearing here.
And Mary, do you believe that we will see images of Viktor Bout? Do we believe that, what do we think is next for him, given your understanding of how Russia operates? If it is a win, as you're suggesting, for Russia, and the people in Russia are suggesting that it is, do we expect to see him paraded in front of the cameras? Do we expect him to receive a medal? Like, what's going to happen?
Right. Well, we know he is now en route back to Russia. I think we'll likely see some pictures of him arriving to Russia when that happens. It's probably going to be aired on Russian state TV. There's a lot of sort of speculation and suggestion that, like Marie Bout had a pretty successful career after her return from the United States. She was deported and she came back to Russia. She now holds official posts. She's, very, very prominent public figure. She has her own show on RT. So I think it is entirely possible that Bout will have some sort of a public role, but we don't know exactly what kind of role could that be. I think, still he will come back to his family first of all, so probably he's going to meet with them. Maybe we'll hear from his wife. Whether he'll be awarded a medal, again, that's also possible. We just don't know at this stage. They're still, waiting for him to arrive to Moscow.
Here in the U.S., there's been some talk about whether or not President Biden would pursue re-election, and that some political wins are certainly the sorts of things that he wants to, the feathers that he wants to put in his cap, should he make that announcement. I'm wondering if there's something similar, happening in Russia as well. We've covered the level of criticism that Vladimir Putin has been receiving domestically for his pursuit of the war in Ukraine that's not going very well. Is this the sort of PR win that he would trumpet, if you will?
I think it's possible because Bout was a really high value target. You have to remember, the amount of U.S. resources that went into his capture and bringing him to the United States and convicting him. That is, something that now is sort of been zeroed in because he's now getting back to Russia earlier than his sort of term. I'm not sure whether that will be the sort of public sell for the Russian public, because I think people are aware of who Bout is. They're aware of this case, but I'm not sure this is sort of the issue that a lot of Russians are very extremely passionate about. But it certainly will instill some kind of patriotic feelings in favor that Russia doesn't give up on their own people, no matter of what they're accused of abroad, and it will work until sort of the very end to bring them back home. It doesn't abandon them. So I think that will work in a lot of sort of conservative circles really, really well.
Right. But Mary, I sort of take your point, and I kind of agree with it that, perhaps in conservative circles, perhaps in circles that are still loyal to Vladimir Putin, this will be something that they will applaud. But for the people that we've seen over the last couple of months, the very brave souls who are protesting the actions of Russia in Ukraine and elsewhere, people who are reporters and journalists who have been reporting on the atrocities committed by the Russians in Ukraine. I suspect that a convicted arms dealer is not the same thing as a person who plays basketball for a living. I mean, that they're going to look at this and say, it's not really the same thing. I mean, they may be high-value individuals to their respective governments, but one is a convicted arms dealer, the merchant of death, and the other one plays a game for a living. And so for the right-minded people in Russia, and let's remember that oftentimes when we talk about the actions of a particular country, we're talking about their leaders and not the people. So when we talk about Iran or Russia, we're not talking about the Iranian people or the Russian people necessarily. We're talking about the governments that are in control of them. So I suspect that, and I wonder if you will hear from some who will say that, that we're not celebrating that this guy is coming home.
Yeah, exactly. And also, we have to remember, Griner actually had fans in Russia. She played for a Russian club.
That's a good point.
She has public support in Russia as well. There are people who were also very, very passionate about seeing her free, seeing her go back to her family. And, people who are, I wouldn't say fans, but people who are welcoming a Bout's release, they're probably, in the Kremlin and the government. Those are not average people who are on the street and thinking about every day what's going to happen to this person who's been convicted about for potentially smuggling, weapons across the world. And Griner is definitely a way more a completely different personality for Russians as well, because she actually has fans here.
Mary Ilyushina, it's always great talking to you, giving us some different sorts of insights. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, the family of Paul Whelan, meantime, are still waiting for his release. So after the break, we're going to tell you what President Biden is saying about him. So stay with us. You're streaming CBS News.
Everybody wakes up in the morning and they are pelted with alerts that frighten them, news that agitates them. With this show, we have the time to explain what's going on. These migrants, they've been released. Explain the status that allows them to be released, to slow things down a little bit. What are the big sets of questions for China and its ambitions? Hackers are stepping up their attacks to extort victims. Let's start with easy. Who's attacking? Here's a deeper understanding of what's happening.
Prime Time with John Dickerson. Stream on the free CBS News app. An original documentary from CBS reports tensions rising between a powerful country and a vital island.
The supply of this technology came grinding to a halt. The world would grind to a halt.
Absolutely. As Taiwan faces threats and aggression,
Taiwan is on the front line, and we understand our responsibility as a democracy. We cannot fall.
CBS News examines whether they can defend themselves.
Putin, Ukraine, China, Taiwan, there are manifestations of the battle between autocracy and democracy. And that is a fight that we're all engaged in.
Defending Taiwan, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
When weather turns extreme,
States from the plains to the northeast are bracing for more than 2 feet of heavy snow.
every second counts.
This is a monster winter storm.
CBS News and the Weather Channel bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
There's a wrinkle in the forecast, the accumulating ice.
You'll have time to get prepared.
Take precautions before you head out.
Feel the forecast on the CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell.
Stories that inform.
Or you can be really old at 60, and you can be really young at 85.
Inspire.
How do we unlock the power within ourselves to be who we want to be?
And brighten your day.
The best part of fame is making people feel good. Always send the people home happy.
Make every day a little more like Sunday morning.
Here comes the sun.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
After decades in the public eye and public service, this mother-daughter duo is now talking about gutsy women. What's the gutsiest thing you've ever done? We go person to person with Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton and Chelsea Clinton.
Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
In today's Money Watch, business analyst Jill Schlesinger is here to help.
How do you even begin to make the best use of your money?
If you've got a match from your employer, don't give away that money.
Dollar Jill, y'all.
CBS Mornings, starting at 7.
All right, welcome back to CBS News. If you're just joining us, Brittney Griner, the American basketball star who had been in prison in Russia on drug charges, was traded for Viktor Bout, who is a convicted arms dealer in Russia. President Biden also discussed Paul Whelan, who's another American citizen being held prisoner in Russia. I want to play a bit of what the president had to say.
We never forgot about Brittney. We've not forgotten about Paul Whelan, who's been unjustly detained in Russia for years. This was not a choice of which American to bring home. We brought home Trevor Reed when we had a chance early this year. Sadly, for totally illegitimate reasons, Russia is treating Paul's case differently than Brittney's. And while we have not yet succeeded in securing Paul's release, we are not giving up. We will never give up.
CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe joins us now from the phone from Washington. So, Ed, again, the news that Brittney Griner is coming home, but of course the tragic, sad news that Paul Whelan is still being held prisoner in Russia. And you saw the statement that we've been sharing with our audience from David Whelan, who celebrates the release of Brittney Griner, says that the Biden administration was right to bring her home, but is very, very concerned that the spotlight will no longer be on Paul. What do you know?
Well, we know that they'll obviously continue pushing for his release, and you saw the president there call it out and say that Russia continues to unjustly detain him. This, of course, has been the work of not only top Biden administration officials and the president since he took office, but there's teams of people at the State Department especially that focus on this, because there are not only Americans, as the administration would classify them, illegally detained in Russia, but in so many other countries around the world, and various agreements and attempts to release them are in the works at all times. And so this is a big, high-profile one, certainly one that has captured the attention of probably, arguably, many more Americans than it might have, just given who she is and what she was doing in Russia and the case that was built in the public sphere to secure her release. But another big, important step for this White House that obviously is fighting to bring Americans home, and we'll be able to say that she was home by the holidays. But this is something that transcends presidents. It has been a problem for many, especially in the post 9/11 era. And I thought it was notable in his statement where he welcomed Griner home, reminded the world that we're still seeking Paul Whelan's release, made clear to Americans, you've got to be more vigilant and careful about traveling to parts of the world where the State Department issues advisories saying that Americans are at risk. And that's not to say that the State Department would never fight for one's release if they were wrongfully detained. But what he is saying is, help avoid that by not making bad decisions about where you travel and the situations you might put yourself in, because you could end up in situations like Brittney Griner and Paul Whelan.
Of course, this is great news for Brittney Griner and her family. But, there's always politics. And I wonder, one could argue another win for the Biden administration, or maybe not. We spoke to, Ambassador John Bolton earlier today, and he said, in fact, this is a loss. This is the Biden administration negotiating from a weakened position.
And that's a criticism that you will hear from many conservative Republicans and neocons like John Bolton. That's no surprise. And this White House, the State Department knew that criticism was coming. They will defend the decision by saying that they had an option here and one they had to take. Otherwise, it would leave an American at risk, and they would rather secure her release than allow her to continue to languish in Russian detention. There's going to be criticism from the Justice Department, current and former officials as well, who were involved in capturing and prosecuting Viktor Bout, and who worry that there may be other high-profile convictions that are essentially on the negotiating table, be it with Russia or with other countries. And certainly other countries will look at this situation and say, well, gee, if they got back Viktor Bout, when the U.S. is holding certain people in federal prisons, maybe we should grab an American or two and see if we can hold them as negotiating leverage. And so that's always the risk. But for a variety of reasons, this was a decision that the White House opted to made it in recent days, and put the final touches on it before announcing this morning's dramatic release.
Ed, before we let you go, we're close to the holidays, obviously, and we saw Brittney Griner's wife there with President Biden, along with the Vice President of the United States. Has the White House released any details as to what might happen next? I know that she's got to undergo a battery of exams and tests, medical and other, but could we potentially see Brittney Griner along with her wife meeting with President Biden at some point in the near future?
Oh, I'm confident the White House would love to make that happen, whether it's at the White House or somewhere else, yes. But first, she will have to undergo medical evaluation, and that'll happen probably, we'll learn later today, most likely, where exactly she is. It could be at the U.S. military medical facilities in Germany or Italy. Could be in the U.K., or they could bring her all the way back to the United States. And if that happens, then she's likely to go to a facility in San Antonio where detainees have been brought before and where other severely wounded in battlefield situations are brought before being allowed to reunite with her family. But undoubtedly, the Griners would want to make that happen, and the president would want to see her. And I would suspect that will happen at some point, whether it's in Washington, whether it's somewhere else, we'll see. Notable that they were able to get Griner's wife to Washington so discreetly and not have it noticed. And that'll be another colorful and interesting element of this, that she was read into it. And also notable that they told the Whelan family. Remember, part of the criticism in the past was the element of surprise, that family members of those still detained were finding out about the fact that their loved one was still left behind in news reports. In this case, that didn't happen. And so the Biden administration clearly trying to do a better job of dotting I's and crossing T's and make sure that the various parties that needed to know are aware and avoid sort of those kinds of missteps that can really sour the mood.
And before we let you go, I mean, that would be kind of an intriguing. I wonder if there's going to be an assignment for somebody to sort of figure out how they got Cherelle Griner into the White House when there's a battery of White House press corps there. And I don't know how that works. I don't know if there's a secret entrance way. I've never been to the White House, so, except as a tourist, right?
Right.
I don't know. Is there a secret driveway?
There's gotta be.
How does that work?
Yeah.
I'm very curious now that you mentioned that.
There are at least 4 public gates where people can come in. We usually come in what's called the Northwest Gate, which is in the northwest corner of the White House property, but there are other entrances where she could have been snuck in early this morning without us necessarily seeing it, because we don't stake out the other 3 the way we walk by the one that we all go through, which is the most public of the entrances. So undoubtedly it was some kind of discrete arrangement, and I'm sure we may learn a little more about that as the day progresses. Yes, you better believe somebody is assigned to figure out how the heck that happened.
I love it. Ed O'Keefe, thank you, my friend. We appreciate it.
And next time you're in Washington, come by the White House.
I would love to. I've never visited.
Yeah.
I've never been in, other than like as a kid. You're getting to tour the White House. It's a dream of mine. I have a dream that
we will fix that.
Thank you, my friend. Appreciate it. All right, Ed O'Keefe for us reporting from the White House. Thank you, Ed. Our coverage of the major breaking news this morning will continue after the break. We'll have much more on the release from Russian custody of WNBA star Brittney Griner. You're streaming CBS News.
An original CBS Reports documentary.
I was entitled to equal pay for equal work under the law.
Does the Supreme Court's power need to be checked?
9 Supreme Court justices, 5 of them said no, she's not entitled. That's not right.
Calls to fix the court tend to go along with the politics of the moment.
Republican-appointed justices have all tended to go in one direction, with the Democratic-appointed justices tending to go in another.
Even though it's only 9 justices, it takes 5 of them to make the law of the land.
Does it have political impact? True. Political intent? Probably not true.
If the American people don't trust the judgment of their court, that's a real problem for our democracy.
An original CBS Reports documentary streaming now. An original CBS Reports documentary.
This place is at the very tip of the spear when it comes to Satanism and witchcraft and demonism.
Has the church been this divided?
Not in my lifetime. They've been radicalized in their approach to politics.
United in Christ, divided by politics.
We have what I call a cowardly pastor problem, because they don't want to get involved in the political situation.
Conservative Christianity and Republicanism have grasped hands in a way that's very unhealthy.
There are churches whose members have divided over partisan politics.
How an evangelical civil war could change the spirit of America.
This was a heavily Christian-influenced attack.
When we have the ability to say that God is on our side, it allows us to justify all kinds of cruelty.
An original CBS Reports documentary streaming now. People from every corner of America facing challenges.
Everyone is just looking for some type of connection.
Just raise your hand and say, hey, I'd like to help.
Coming together to find solutions.
We are going to do something about it.
Their stories are our stories.
Welcome to Eye on America.
Stream now on the free CBS News app. An original documentary from CBS Reports. As the nation of Hungary evolves toward autocracy,
if you define an autocrat as someone that the people can no longer get rid of, even when there are elections, he's definitely an autocrat.
Some American conservatives like what they see.
Viktor Orban has done a tremendous job, and you've kept your country safe.
CBS Reports explores their growing alliance.
I have come to Texas. We should unite our forces.
So there are a ton of booths here, a lot of young people here.
And what it means for American democracy.
Prime Minister Orban is being accused of all kinds of things simply because he doesn't toe that liberal line. He stands for Christian conservative values.
To sum up, the mother is a woman, the father is a man, and leave our kids alone. Full stop, end of discussion.
A new conservative alliance, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
All right, so we're continuing to cover this breaking news now that Brittney Griner is on her way home, released in a prisoner swap. She has been in custody in Russia in a penal colony, serving the beginning of a 9-year sentence for bringing cannabis oil into Russia. We want to bring in Nina Khrushcheva. She is joining us now from Moscow. She is a professor of international affairs at the New School. Nina, thanks for sort of standing by with us. I spoke to you earlier when this news was really just breaking. I'm wondering if now at all, if there has been any further media coverage in Moscow about this.
It has been that Viktor Bout is on the way home, that he has been released, that neither Griner nor him are going to serve any more sentence because they've been pardoned before their release. So it's all kind of a brouhaha excitement. We got our Viktor Bout. And it's interesting because, of course, in America, Brittney Griner has been talked about for a long, long time for this whole 9 months. But Viktor Bout has not been. I mean, he is really not a hero of Russia in any way. And now I think he's slowly, something we spoke about earlier today, he's now slowly turning into that hero.
So can I ask you, Professor, then, and we asked Ambassador John Bolton what information he could share with us about why Viktor Bout is such an important person for Vladimir Putin. Maybe you can answer for us. What is his high profile? What is his value to the Russian government?
Well, I mean, it is a big story. I mean, he's the kind of person that had films made about him. I mean, we know that. We spoke about it earlier as well. So he's that kind of lord of war that captured global imagination. But also, given the relationship that Russia and America has today, he is very symbolic figure as well, because he's somebody who fights wars. He's that kind of heroic mercenary. I mean, I'm sure, I don't know exactly, but I bet you've been speaking about the Wagner group and Prigozhin, the ones that are very loudly fighting the war in Ukraine. Sorry.
What are your expectations today?
We can hear you breaking up just a little bit. I'm not sure if you're kind of getting a call in or you're getting another kind of voice.
I just saw Bout saying that he's doing well, and I'm sure that now he's going to do much. I mean, going to do better when he's in Russia.
Yeah, I'm sure. So how much do you believe? And maybe you've seen this sort of before, but that Brittney Griner was simply kind of a pawn in this whole theater to perhaps get Viktor Bout back?
Well, I'm not sure. I think that at the time when it happened, I don't think that Bout, and she is a pawn, and she's, of course, her crimes, if they are crimes, not a crime, is incomparable. I mean, really, absolutely comparable, but it almost doesn't matter because I'm sure we spoke about it, and you remember at the beginning, the United States wasn't even considering Bout as a possibility to exchange for anybody. Then maybe it would be 2 for 1, and now it's 1 for 1. So I guess clearly the Biden administration decided that it's better to get somebody and to get rid of Bout, because ultimately, what's value of Bout isn't there, because the relationship at such a low point, on almost minus point that Bout or no Bout, it's not going to get better. It's not going to change. And so it did seem to be at least a life for a life. So you get rid of Bout, let the Russians deal with it because they're going to do their own propaganda anyway. And so at least this woman can have Christmas at home. So in some ways, I think the release is the sign of a horrible relationship rather than the release is a sign of a relationship that may get better somehow.
All right, Nina, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to have much more on this story after the break. We'll play some sound from Brittney Griner's wife, Cherelle Griner. She spoke at the White House this morning about the WNBA star's release and the promise she's making to help other prisoners like Brittney, like Paul Whelan, come home. Stay with us. You're streaming CBS News.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
The carnage in our nation's schools has become painfully repetitive.
Not one more child! School shootings have parents fighting mad.
I promised my daughter I was gonna fight. It's gonna keep on happening.
And teachers taking lessons in how to fight back.
This is an exercise.
We approach it as it's you or them.
It shouldn't have to be your teacher's job to protect your life.
But will the battle over gun control,
People are afraid that they're going to lose their gun rights altogether.
be the hardest lesson of all?
The exercise, you're having to shoot at an adult. Are you prepared to have to kill one of your students?
Guns in the Classroom, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Go to the ends of the earth.
Right now.
We got something crazy. And reach for the stars.
Here we are.
Time.
Yes, it's my comeback.
Hey, this is pretty fun. But wait, there's more.
Experience thought-provoking,
I'm open to the idea of being a human being.
innovative, and truly original reporting.
Look through a telescope and go, wow.
Because there's always something new under the sun on CBS Sunday morning.
Stories that inform.
You can be really old at 60, and you can be really young at 85.
Inspire.
How do we unlock the power within ourselves to be who we want to be?
And brighten your day.
The best part of fame is making people feel good. Always send the people home happy.
Make every day a little more like Sunday morning.
Here comes the sun.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
What are the words you would use to describe the Queen?
Kind, caring, and a nice lady.
I'm here for you. America needs drivers.
And we're here to help.
What are you learning from Girls on the Run?
Never give up and to always keep trying.
You can see fire and rescue is up. They're doing wellness checks when people are trapped inside their homes.
We're gonna be okay. We're gonna make it.
You ready?
A generation of kids opens up on CBS Reports.
I just want to be like a regular kid.
Their world, their struggles, their voices.
What if I was white?
A lot of people like to call names and make you feel ashamed for being proud of who you are. Technology is baked into the DNA of our generation.
Now streaming Chasing Fame.
I like being famous. I would love for my career to launch.
Is the hunt for social media popularity an opportunity?
To get verified is one of my big goals. If I get the blue check mark, it would open a lot of doors.
Or an obsession?
I spend a lot of time looking in the mirror because I want to look perfect.
Are the kids all right? Chasing Fame, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
We are so excited, we just can't hide it.
CBS mornings are, well, everything your morning should be.
Let's do it!
Let's go! CBS mornings, starting at 7.
Well, right now, WNBA star Brittney Griner is on a plane heading back to the U.S. after a prisoner swap between the U.S. and Russia. We've learned that Griner is expected back in the U.S. within 24 hours. Griner has spent almost 10 months in Russian custody. In exchange for her release, the U.S. swapped convicted arms dealer Viktor Bout. Griner was arrested in Moscow in February of this year for the possession of less than 1 gram of cannabis oil. She was later sentenced to 9 years in prison. She was moved to a penal colony about a month ago after a Russian court denied her appeal. Earlier, Griner's wife, Cherelle, spoke at the White House, and here's what she had to say.
Today, my family is whole, but as you all are aware, there's so many other families who are not whole. And so BG's not here to say this, but I will gladly speak on her behalf and say that BG and I will remain committed to the work of getting every American home, including Paul, whose family is in our hearts today. As we celebrate BG being home, we do understand that there are still people out here who are enduring what I endured the last 9 months of missing tremendously their loved ones.
All right, CBS News correspondent Christina Ruffini is standing by in Washington to talk about this. You know, some people are just waking up to this news right now. Christina, can we talk a little bit about the difficulties and the pros and cons of engaging in a prisoner swap of this nature?
Well, it is controversial, but there's always a little bit of controversy with these negotiations because you have to offer something, right? There's a reason these Americans were targeted. There's a reason they're being held, the U.S. calls it wrongfully detained, but essentially being held hostage by these governments. This is not exclusive to Russia. We've seen it in Iran. We've seen it in Venezuela. These governments hold on to Americans, that blue passport, because that makes you a target of some of these administrations because they know if they have Americans in their custody, that's bad news for whatever president is in office. That's been a difficult struggle with the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and the Biden White House. So our understanding this morning is this was a one-for-one offer, which we've known, but the Russians said that Paul Whelan was not an option. So officials are telling us this morning that, you know, it wasn't that they had to choose between one or the other. It was Griner or no one. So they felt they had to go ahead with Griner. Now, the controversy here is, are you giving up your biggest chip to play, right? Viktor Bout is this international arms dealer. He's responsible for thousands of deaths all over the world. He's trafficked guns to Africa, to conflicts, you know, name a continent, he's been involved in it. At one point, he was literally smuggling coltan, which is a rare earth mineral, out of the DRC and flying it to Asia to be processed. I mean, he's a bad dude, and people did not want to give him up. But at some point, at the highest levels, the calculation was made that they needed to get Brittney Griner home. And so they decided to do this swap, to do it the one-for-one, that go ahead with it. But of course, that leaves Paul Whelan, who's been there for 4 years now, without an obvious trajectory about how to get him out of there. Now, you heard from the White House that they are still committed to his release. We've heard from other officials that they are still working on it. They believe they have different ways of doing that. But I think it's interesting this time that there's been a lot of emphasis on Paul, both from, you heard Griner's wife, Sherelle, mention his name. The president has mentioned his name. Officials have mentioned his name. Because last time when Trevor Reed, who was the other American who was very ill, he was swapped for another Russian. There was a bit of a fumble, and you know, it was unclear if the Whelan family was informed ahead of time, and there was less of an emphasis on, hey, you still got some guys in custody. So I think the White House is very sensitive to that. I think they want to make sure that, you know, they know that there's someone else there. He's a former Marine, and he's not forgotten. And I thought that was very interesting to hear it from Griner's wife as well, that she is aware, and she said she and Brittney, when she's back, she was going to speak on her behalf. You know, they're going to keep fighting for other Americans illegally detained.
One thing that you talked about in our last hour, Christina, was how the Russians play this diplomatic game, if diplomacy is even the right word for it, the red tape, the bureaucracy that they implement in order to make this theater, political theater. Can you explain that for our audience who may just be joining us now?
Of course. You know, we talked about the fact that the Russians wield red tape like a weapon. They wield their bureaucracy very adeptly, and they make life very hard for Americans who are serving in Russia just in general, but especially if diplomats are trying to gain access to Americans in Russian custody, right? You can't just walk up to a prison and knock on the door and say, hey, that's my dude, I want to talk to him. You have to get permission. You have to get the Russian government's permission. So I've been told over the years they do things like, okay, here are the 20 forms you have to fill out to go see this prisoner, and they fill them out and they deliver them. Oh, no, you deliver them to the wrong bureaucracy. You're there at this ministry, they need to go to this ministry. So, you know, that's a couple days. You go back, pick up the forms, you send them in. A day or two later, it comes back. Oh, well, you filled it out with the wrong color ink. We're going to need you to redo them. So there's this constant dragging and just making it as difficult as possible to try to make the U.S., to make these officials jump through hoops. Then once they get there, you know, once they're put in these permanent prisons, these work camps, they're really far from where any U.S. facilities are. So you got to get out there. It can take as long as a day to drive. You have to go through all the security checks just to get access to these people, just to talk to them. Then, you know, we remember there was this call with Brittney Griner that was dropped and it didn't get through to her wife. Part of the reason for that is because there's been this diplomatic spat where the Russians have told all the locals who have worked at the U.S. Embassy for years and years and years, America does this all the way around the world. We have our diplomats, and then the staff, we employ local people, and you know they have security clearances, they've been vetted, but some of these members of staff had worked there for decades. The Russians have banned local staff from working at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. In addition to that, they've PNG'd, which means they've kicked out of the country about a dozen or so diplomats, so they're really, really on bare bones. So they're making them jump through all these hoops, fill out all these paperworks, try to get this effective diplomacy done, and they're doing it with less and less people. It's just an extremely difficult situation for the Americans who are working for the release of their compatriots.
All right, Christina Ruffini reporting. Thank you, Christina, as always. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Our coverage of the major breaking news this morning will continue after the break. We'll have much more on the release from Russian custody of WNBA star Brittney Griner. Our Scott McFarland will join us from Capitol Hill after the break. Streaming CBS News.
An original CBS Reports documentary.
Yoga and wellness has become a place of anti-science.
Online clickbait.
The algorithms feed you content based upon your own fantasy.
Potentially at my peril.
There's no question about it.
Spreading digital disinformation.
Their entire yoga studio and spiritual community got so embedded in all of the QAnon stuff that it became this sick place.
Why pro-health people are fertile ground for anti-science messages.
We can just go into the whole mask thing. A lot of us just believe that's symbolism for silencing people.
People are locked in this mindset. They've been taught to accept what the medical doctors say.
No longer are you going to be willing to take any medical advice.
It's a big problem that we urgently need to address.
An original CBS Reports documentary streaming now. An original CBS Reports documentary.
We need to put an end to this territorial status.
Will statehood create a better Puerto Rico?
So that we have the same quality of life that you see in the States.
What do you worry about?
Me living here in the future.
They're giving incentives to non-Puerto Ricans to come to Puerto Rico
and extract our natural resources and take over our land.
Vacation in Puerto Rico, and in exchange for that, you don't pay taxes.
Why would I allow somebody who abused me for 123 years to then consume me?
An original CBS Reports documentary streaming now.
When weather turns extreme.
States from the plains to the northeast are bracing for more than 2 feet of heavy snow.
Every second counts.
This is a monster winter storm.
CBS News and the Weather Channel bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
There's a wrinkle in the forecast, the accumulating ice.
You'll have time to get prepared.
Take precautions before you head out.
Feel the forecast on the CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell.
People from every corner of America facing challenges.
Everyone is just looking for some type of connection.
Just raise your hand and say, hey, I'd like to help.
Coming together to find solutions.
We are going to do something about it.
Their stories are our stories.
Welcome to Eye on America.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
We are so excited, we just can't hide it.
CBS Mornings are, well, everything your morning should be.
Let's do it! Let's go!
CBS Mornings, starting at 7. Stories that inform, inspire, and brighten your day.
The best part of fame is making people feel good.
Make every day a little more like Sunday morning.
Here comes the sun.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
Everybody wakes up in the morning and they are pelted with alerts that frighten them, news that agitates them. With this show, we have the time to explain what's going on. What are the big sets of questions for China and its ambitions? Here's a deeper understanding of what's happening.
Primetime with John Dickerson. Stream on the free CBS News app.
All right, so we are going to continue to cover the breaking news about Brittney Griner being released from custody in Russia, but we do have some other news to tell you about. The power is back on for tens of thousands of people in North Carolina who lost it after an attack on 2 electric substations there. Electricity was out for 5 days for most people. Investigators are now looking for whoever targeted the stations, and they're trying to figure out why they did it. But the FBI did post this flyer asking the public for information. Officials are offering a reward of up to $75,000 for information leading to the attacker or attackers. And we are learning new details